We're going to get started here. Hi, I'm Sarah Butler. I'm the director of the Center for Historical Research here at Ohio State, and we are really excited about today's talk. I should point out that Mitchell Merback was supposed to be here last year to end off our series, and we were so excited until we discovered that I accidentally planned it for the same day as the eclipse. Okay. Well, he very kindly was willing to shift things to this fall instead. So I wanted to make sure to thank a few groups who have helped to make this talk possible. The Department of History, the Department of the History of Art, the Department of German and Germanic Languages and Literature, and the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. I also want to make sure, just to tell you in advance, that if you are excited about this talk, guess what? It is part of a series. We are doing a series on the history of anger. And our next talk is going to be November 18th. It's actually going to be a talk over Zoom. And if you want to make sure that you get information about it, there is a pad of paper going around that is both an attendance list and please put your email down here if you want to hear more about it. But this is Derek Pensler of Harvard University is coming to talk on righteous anger as a political emotion, Jews, Arabs, and the question of Palestine, 1947 to 1949. Now I'm going to turn over things to Carl Whittington, both professor and chair of the history of art, who is going to introduce our speaker for today. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Mitch Merback and welcome him to Ohio State. Dr. Merback is professor and also department chair of the Department of History of Art at Johns Hopkins University, and is truly one of the world's leading experts of 15th and 16th century Northern European art. He began his education as an artist. I didn't know that until I looked at your CV before attending the University of Chicago for his PhD in art history. He's a prolific and influential scholar whose contributions are difficult to describe in a short introduction. I continue to think of him through the lens of the first work of his that I encountered, his 1999 first book, The Thief, the Cross, and the Wheel, Pain and the Spectacle of Punishment in Medieval and Renaissance Europe, a work that I've returned to over and over and teach in the classroom almost every year. In this book, Merback explored the links between the increasingly violent depictions of Christ's crucifixion and the spectacle of corporal punishment in Northern European cities, arguing that both artists and viewers increasingly created and viewed art through the lens of contemporary rituals of punishment. The book is really a model of Merback's method, which combines deep historical inquiry with incisive readings of images. His second book, Pilgrimage and Pogrom, Violence, Memory, and Visual Culture at the Host Miracle Shrines of Germany and Austria, published in 2013, took him even deeper into the micro-histories of particular sites. I love books like this that dig you really, really into a few tiny places and get into it. This is really a fantastic book, which in this case illuminated the complex emergence of anti-Jewish discourses and violence around shrines to the Holy Blood of Christ. This book was part of a long engagement with Christian representations of Jews in Northern Europe and the role played by images and material culture in anti-Jewish discourses and violence. That included an edited volume as well called Beyond the Yellow Badge. His third book, as well as I understand his next one, not published yet, but the third published one explored the artist Albrecht Dürer, which came out in 2017. It's called Perfection's Therapy, and it's one of these fun art history books that is an entire book on a single artwork, Dürer's famous print of Melancholia I. This has developed into a new book project, almost completed, on the concept of the philosophical image in the art of Dürer and his circle. In addition to these books, he's published influential articles in every journal of the discipline and has received fellowships from institutions such as the American Academy in Berlin, the Clark Art Institute, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies, and many others. So today he'll be speaking about the artist Pieter Bruegel, a particular favorite of mine, so I'm delighted to hear his talk today on Bruegel's Anger. Please join me in welcoming him to Ohio State.
Well, thank you, Carl, for that especially generous introduction. want to also take a moment to thank Bruno and Sarah for the very, very kind introduction and the flexibility of realizing we had almost, hit a comet. And it was interesting that after doing that, we rescheduled for October 7th, and a week or so after I was thinking, what is significant about that date? Oh yeah. So here we are on a day of anger and still disbelief that we don't have an end to the Israeli-Hamas war. So I was glad to hear that you have an upcoming speaker who's going to address that very, very important issue. Today's foray into the 16th century might seem a little bit perverse, or maybe a kind of escape from the agonies of the present, but maybe you'll agree that it's an honest escape. We arrive at the visionary scene in media res, witness to an onslaught led by a helmeted goddess wielding a sword and brandishing a torch, identified in the caption below. She is Ira, anger. Preceded by her furious animal companion, the bear, who tears into the leg of a fallen victim, she ignites the charge as a torrent of grotesque warriors spill out of a war tent, headed up by infantrymen who slice through naked bodies with an oversized butcher knife. Closing ranks behind them is another troop of terror, this one advancing behind a mobile war shield fitted with a perverse, serrated tongue and guided by reptilian demons inflamed with battle lust. Punishments, brutalities, and vengeful rites unrelated to their campaigns spread over the landscape, signs of anger's total conquest. A horrendous screeching monster rains blows upon a victim while a ravenous she-wolf locks her jaws around her fallen prey. In a ramshackle shed, rigged against a hollow tree, another demon executioner slow roasts a naked man upon a spit, while above them avian predators battle for supremacy of the skies. Stumbling over a large barrel which serves as a miniature theater for a tavern brawl, daggers are drawn, throats are being slit. We see a caped and hooded giant, knife clenched in teeth, holding out a strange half-filled flask. The enormous figure lurches toward a burning cauldron perched atop anger's war tent. There, an amorous couple are engulfed in boiling oil and surrounded by sulfurous plumes, a final embrace amidst unfathomable pain. The picture I'm describing is just one in a suite of 7 allegorical prints devoted to the vices produced for the Antwerp publishing house Aux 80 at the Sign of the Four Winds, whose proprietor, Hieronymus Koch, was a key force in the professionalization of image publishing in the Renaissance. Koch issued the engravings in 1558 and followed them 1 year later with a companion series on the virtues. The designer of both was the inimitable Pieter Bruegel the Elder, native son of Brabant, who had established himself as a master of the Guild of St. Luke in Antwerp around 1551. Today, Bruegel is beloved the world over as the painter of proverbs, landscapes, and peasants. But in the late 1550s, his reputation hinged entirely on his work as a designer of engravings. As a clear sign of Bruegel's stature among collectors, all 7 of the preliminary drawings for the Vices series have survived, and all are dated 1557 except for one, Avarice, completed the year before. From them, we know that for the most part, Koch's published engravings remained true to Bruegel's designs. To drive home the moral of the allegory, verses in Latin and Flemish were appended to the lower margin. About anger, we read, "Anger makes the mouth swell up, and the veins grow black with blood." Elaborating slightly, the Flemish subscript explains, "Anger swells the mouth, poisons the mood, disrupts the spirit, and blackens the blood." Symptomatic of the bigger dysfunctions of social and mental life it causes, anger, quite simply, makes us ugly. When Bruegel designed his era in 1557, he did so both as an aspiring independent master, out to make a name for himself, and a market-savvy imitator of the imagery associated with his famous predecessor, Hieronymus Bosch, who also hailed from the Duchy of Brabant. Numerous emulators and copyists throughout the Netherlands were capitalizing on the Bosch mystique in these years. Boschian hybrids, demons, and biomorphs run rampant through the Seven Vices series, testifying to the magnetic attraction Bosch's generative fantasy held for a talented draftsman like Bruegel. Yet Bruegel was no slavish imitator. To engage with Bosch, he knew he had to be like that artful honeybee in the ancient trope favored by Renaissance writers, gathering pollen from multiple flowers, storing and digesting it, then transforming the mixture into delicious art. It has been said with some justice that Bruegel succeeded in surpassing Bosch at the master's game. Seen in these terms, the great battle pieces of his career, the painting in Brussels known as the Fall of the Rebel Angels, or the design for the Battle of the Strong Boxes, only cemented Bruegel's reputation as a, quote, second Bosch, the epithet given him in 1567 by the critic Lodovico Guicciardini. So there are no two ways about it. Anger threatens life and limb, brings disorder to society, and disfigures us, body and soul. Now, in a print series slated for public circulation, the rebuke to anger had to be morally clear-cut. By contrast, the attitude on display in Bruegel's second major treatment of the theme, the large panel signed and dated 1562, is much harder to pin down. Overripe with Boschian phantasmagoria, the painting gets its traditional name from Karel van Mander's brief notice in Het Schilderboek, where he reports that Bruegel painted a Dulle Griet, Mad Margaret or Mad Meg, referring to the armored Amazonian hausfrau who storms across the landscape as it erupts with warfare and strife. Bruegel's personification of martial fury is wholly original and may refer to that specifically female variety of anger traditionally linked with domestic power struggles, or even that hysterical, quote-unquote, version of melancholy which afflicts women exclusively. As she sallies forth, loaded down with pots and pans, there's no mistaking her close kinship with Lady Anger from the lower zone of the engraving. And there are other indications that the two works share the same logic. Both Dulle Griet and Era divide their allegorical significance between two figures. In the painting, it is this figure here, this contrived Atlas figure who is spooning coins from his rear end, a figure that appears to personify folly. Meanwhile, in the engraving, the subsidiary role is played by the strange hooded giant who I showed you earlier, typically interpreted as drunkenness. Curiously, Era is the only composition in the Vices series where the personified concept is doubled in this way. The other six place a single allegorical figure at the composition's center, clearly marking her out as female. If Dulle Griet can be said to thematize madness and folly as bedfellows in sin, Era seems to explore the two most pervasive expressions of anger: warfare, its most destructive form, and drunkenness, anger at its most sinful. Each devastates the mind. Each manifests its own form of insanity. Each spawns its own brand of folly. Such equations circulated as moralizing commonplaces among the humanist authors of Bruegel's day. Erasmus, for example, in his influential Manual of the Christian Knight, 1503, declared, quote, "Between a madman and someone crazed with anger, there is not much more difference than that between chronic and temporary insanity." Despite its continuing salience among early modern moralists, anger as an organizing theme virtually disappears from Bruegel's work after Mad Meg. Only very late in his career, in that masterpiece of unhinged Bacchic inebriation, The Wine of St. Martin's Day, does the blockade lift, and for one last time in his art, anger surfaces, like some ineluctable force of nature, a collective madness, in this case sparked by drink. But to call this retreat from the imagery of anger and absence would be misleading. So let me be more precise about the significance of this gap in Bruegel's oeuvre, and more contextual in accounting for it. In this way, I can also outline the argument for this paper. Looking over the full span of the artist's career, about basically 1550 to his untimely death in 1569, we can venture that Bruegel's thematic engagement with anger passes through 3 stages. The first, which we've already surveyed, corresponds closely with his strong investment in Boschian imagery, though we must be careful here not to mistake correlation with causation. Let's call this mode he adopts in works like Era and Dulle Griet the critique of anger and folly and madness. Note my parenthetical additions. The early modern critique of anger was always bound up with the critique of folly and the collective mental breakdown critics called madness. Anger is rarely diagnosed in isolation. A second phase manifests across a small group of works dated or datable to 1562 or 63, I call speculations on anger. Though executed in the same year as Dulle Griet, none are addressed specifically to anger's place among the vices or its special power as a source of sin. This group includes the Boschian Rebel Angels, the panoramic Suicide of Saul in Vienna, here, and the darkly apocalyptic Triumph of Death today in Madrid, to which we'll return. For reasons I'll make clear a bit later, I call the mode uniting these 3 paintings speculations on anger and death. Then we have a third phase, extending from about 1563 to the artist's death in 1569, a period which betrays no perceptible interest in such thematics at all, with the exception of the wine of St. Martin's Day. For the theme of anger to recede from Bruegel's purview in the way I'm describing might not seem like such a big deal. Market factors, or the artist's responsiveness to the dictates or desires of patrons, could easily explain it. We might chalk it up to the natural evolution any artist's range of interests will undergo, a temperamental shift, for example, to celebratory themes, such as we find in the peasant pictures and in the spectacular cycle of the months, most of which are in Vienna. And yet, if there ever was a time for a native son of Brabant to be reflecting on the depredations and evils wrought by anger, it was the turbulent period following the ascent of Philip II to the Spanish throne, 1556, and the new emperor's incendiary departure from the Netherlands in 1559. Regressive tax policies, anti-Protestant censorship, and increasingly harsh measures for suppressing dissent followed under Margaret of Parma, Philip's governor in the Netherlands, policies which lit the flames of protest, iconoclasm, revolt, and military resistance. As you may know, the Habsburg response to this resistance was brutal and unforgiving. Military invasion, inquisition, and forced re-Catholicization under the Iron Duke Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, the third Duke of Alva, who marched his troops over the Alps in the winter of 1567, inaugurating a reign of terror that culminated in a string of massacres in 1571. Although death was kind to Bruegel and spared him the pain of witnessing the very worst of these events with his own eyes, the last full decade of his life was truly a time of unmitigated crisis. In the face of all this repression, injustice, and violence, even a peace-loving man would find the anger of his countrymen justified and might see a certain utility in anger. Was Bruegel political? Do his pictures carry a hidden polemic? Or is the air of detachment, irony, and philosophical distance that imbues his art with its peculiar poetic power a sign that he preferred to remain above the fray? Across the long arc of modern art historical commentary, the pendulum has swung several times on this question. One position favors the image of Bruegel as an artist of conviction, a resistance fighter wielding satire against an oppressive church-state apparatus. Another sees him as a genteel universalist, a sympathetic and non-partisan spectator in the great Theatrum Mundi. Each of these opposing views, taken on its own, has proven unsatisfying to his biographers. To reconcile the two views, a distinguished line of Bruegel commentators has put in place a third explanation, grounded in the painter's penchant for paradox, obscurity, and ambiguity, strategies capable of deflecting accusations of impropriety or impiety during times of censorship. A pioneer of this view, the art historian Irving Zupnik, wrote, quote, under the guise of a moralist attacking vice, Bruegel seems to have played a sort of shell game, hiding the object of his intentions among the empty vessels. If we refuse to acknowledge these efforts, we deny that he was sensitive to the anguish of his compatriots, end quote. Thus, the older question, was Bruegel ever political, has morphed into another. Is Bruegel ever telling the truth? Closely related to this is the view that Bruegel's essential mode was parody, and that it's been said that often a deep and abiding anger serves as the motivation for the best parodistic work. We see it when Bruegel takes aim at the inflated reverence accorded to classical form in Italian art and art criticism. This has been called Bruegel's aesthetics of subversion, and we may well wonder if, beneath it, there is something even darker, something like the sheer pessimism he portrayed in his emblematic figure of the misanthrope, a figure physically and spiritually shrouded in black, like the weeping philosopher Heraclitus, unable to laugh at his own predicament. A moral spiritual self-portrait of the artist? It has been asked. I'm inclined not to think so. So what kind of anger can we ever plausibly attribute to Bruegel? If there's a case to be made for the generative value of Bruegel's anger, it means grasping something more expansive. We get closer to that when we think in terms of what has been called visionary anger, the righteous indignation modeled by the prophet or the preacher, who take aim at the authors of the world's injustices, the hypocrites, the merchants of disinformation, the evildoers. If that profile helps us make sense of the anger playing in the background of Bruegel's parodies and paradoxes, we can go ahead and provisionally induct him into that great historical confraternity of angry artists, Cellini, Caravaggio, Goya, Daumier, and also which includes women as well, Carolee Schneemann, Gina Birch, or maybe even Artemisia Gentileschi. Artists who turned anger into devastating satire, or into viscerally powerful art, or a kind of philosophical medicine. Something like this latter category, the medicinal, is what I believe comes into play across that long stretch in Bruegel's career when anger, quote, disappears as an explicit iconographic theme. Let's call it the therapy of anger, and consider the possibility that the allegorical image, the Bruegelian picture in particular, had a unique role to play in realizing its potential. Specifically, I wish to consider Bruegel's painting as touchstones for a certain kind of cognitive labor aimed at overcoming the passions, steering the mind toward reasoning, and thereby moving the individual toward what ancient ethicists called tranquility of mind. This ascription is part of a larger effort to treat Bruegel's pictures as philosophical images, a project my Venn diagram may or may not help you understand, but I'm not going to help it. It's just going to be there while I talk. Philosophical images, in my view, realize their cultural value within programs of ethical spiritual training that lead to a remodeling of the individual's entire habitus, an ancient ideal. They pose questions about how one might cultivate mental constancy amidst swings of fortune, how the passions and unruly desires might be subordinated to reason, and how the ills of the mind might be healed by a careful attention to self. Now, to describe Bruegel's art along these lines might sound like a train wreck of anachronisms waiting to happen. But these ancient imperatives were in fact live resources in Renaissance intellectual culture, and they were gaining steam in Bruegel's lifetime. Our contextualization of all this may begin by noting the intellectual company Bruegel kept, namely the circle of humanists around the Antwerp geographer Abraham Ortelius. In the intellectual culture of the early modern Netherlands, Ortelius was a galvanic figure. His advocacy for a non-partisan spiritualism is nearly as well documented as his friendship with Bruegel, whose eulogy he crafted 3 years after the painter's death for inclusion in his famous album Amicorum. It's my contention that the group arrayed around Ortelius, which in addition to Bruegel included the publisher Christoph Plantin, the rhetorician Hans Frankert, and the theologian and engraver Dirk Kornhert, that these men united around a form of Irenic spiritualism, deeply informed by Stoicism. Inspiration came directly from the authorities whose works were becoming available in critical editions around this time, the Greek philosopher Epictetus, and 2 revered Roman authors, Cicero, who was not a card-carrying Stoic, and Lucius Annaeus Seneca, who was. For Seneca's perspective on the passions, the Antwerp humanists naturally would have turned to his immortal treatise, De Ira, on anger, a work whose content and structure, I suggest, shaped the therapeutic agenda behind Bruegel's pictures from about 1562 onward. By taking a close look at one of Bruegel's most allegorically complex works, I will argue that the special hermeneutical activity incited by the Bruegelian picture opened a pathway for remedying the passions, a pathway which, in some respects, parallels the one Seneca offered in De Ira. Seneca's reputation, which gained steadily among Christian readers from the 12th century onward and peaked in the warm embrace of northern humanists like Erasmus, Ortelius, and Justus Lipsius, ensured that Seneca's philosophical ethics would permeate the 16th century's discourse on anger. Before turning back to Bruegel, a few words must be said about early modern discourses on anger. For any modestly educated European in the 16th century, to reflect on anger as a shared human experience or a moral social problem meant locating oneself, consciously or not, at the intersection of 3 entrenched discourses. For simplicity's sake, we can call these the biblical, the medical, and the philosophical. Time does not allow for any meaningful discussion of all 3, let alone their many intersections, so I'll confine myself to simple descriptions. Biblical anger is preeminently divine anger. God's capacity for furious displeasure and his manner of showing it is the centerpiece of a divine pedagogy, runs episodically through the Pentateuch, and finds different modes of expression in the prophetic books of the Hebrew Bible. Its narrative emplotment concerns first and foremost that distinctive form of crisis brought on when Israel sins and fails to uphold the covenant. Divine displeasure with sin also forms the critical context for a long tradition of worship, bridging Christianity and Judaism. The search for ways repentance, for example, might appease God's righteous anger is one of the great tropes found throughout the Psalms. O God, why hast thou cast us off unto the end? Why is thy wrath enkindled against the sheep of my pasture? Psalm 73:10. In Thomas von Villach's moving frescoes in the village church of St. George in Gerlamus, Austria, it is Christ himself who takes up the role of the heavenly archer, raining arrows of pestilence upon the trembling sheep, while only the compassionate mercy of the Virgin Mother stands between humanity and God's anger. More closely keyed to the syndromes of everyday life was the discourse of natural medicine. Stretching from antiquity to the Enlightenment, medical thinking conceived anger as an emotion, or in the Galenic tradition, a passion, one that presented special challenges to health, mental and physical, in a circular system of causes and effects. That is, although passions such as anger clearly affected the body, authorities from the Hippocratic physicians forward, who saw them principally as affectations of the soul, knew that such psychic disturbances always upended the optimal mixture of the body's vital elements, the humors, thus causing disease. And the pains of ill health could, in turn, inflame the mind and weaken reason. What you see here is the German artist Hans Schöffelein's physiognomic portraits of the four temperaments today divided between Kreuzlingen and Vienna. In this series, the melancholic is portrayed as cunning, yet very much in possession of his wits, it seems. By contrast, it's the choleric who, buffeted by external and internal forces, seems to reel in confusion behind features so deformed that his face looks like it's ready to implode. Despite minor challenges to certain aspects of Galen's doctrine, humoral physiology remained the baseline perception for those inclined to judge anger's effects, comprehend its natural causes, and study its physiognomic consequences. A third discursive stream likewise staked its authority on classical authors, specifically the philosophical schools, where an often uncompromising stance on the need to control anger held sway. Among the pagan writers on the emotions, several devoted monographs specifically to anger, and two of them have survived nearly intact. One is Plutarch's Greek dialogue on the control of anger, written around 100 CE. The other is Seneca the Younger's Latin prose treatise De Ira, completed around 49 to 50. Other treatises have come down to us only in fragments, but with significant portions devoted to ethical studies and anger in particular. Cicero's Tusculan Disputations is one example. Prescriptions for dealing with anger in the Greco-Roman philosophical tradition run the gamut from resisting or restraining anger in speech and behavior through efforts to proscribe or eliminate angry words and deeds, to the total suppression or eradication of the very impulses and feelings which spawn anger in the first place. Each school took up its distinctive position along the spectrum of surveillance, control, and repression. Now, for a number of reasons, Seneca's treatise, which shared with Plutarch's dialogue an overarching concern with the therapy of anger, achieved the greatest literary fame. To assert its value for the historical study of anger, therefore, requires no special pleading, and for this gathering especially, I trust a full exposition is not necessary. So here instead is a quick 5-point overview of the arguments in Seneca's book. And I realize I left my water here on the floor. Okay, so our quick version of Seneca. Against the Aristotelian view that anger, if properly moderated, could be useful in the pursuit of virtue, in the way, for example, it assists courage, and the idea that under the right circumstances the desire for revenge could be reasonable, Seneca took a stand in 5 key areas. Number 1, Seneca unequivocally regards anger as a threat to human flourishing and the attainment of the good. Not only is social harmony undone by anger, the emotion lays siege to every support of psychic health in the individual. Given the irresistible power it exerts, once given sway over reason, he argues, anger should count as a disease of the mind. Point number 2. We are at our most grotesque, morally and physically, when anger goes unchecked. Surrendering to it, we become deformed and forfeit our entire sense of self. Anger is not a mark of strength or courageous nobility, but the opposite, a womanish and childish vice, as Seneca puts it. Tantamount to insanity, anger is ugly, ignoble, and never in accord with nature. Number 3. Even the modest allowance that Aristotle makes for anger's utility is unacceptable, according to Seneca, since there can be no such thing as a good amount of a disease, no matter how small. It is therefore not enough merely to moderate or restrain anger when and where it manifests. It must be overcome and ideally eradicated at its source. For anger is not merely an infringement on virtue, but rather virtue's very antithesis. As soon as we sense anger's presence, Seneca says, we're obligated to eradicate virtue from the mind. Point number 4. In line with the Stoic view, Seneca holds the proclivity toward anger to be an outgrowth of habitual misjudgments concerning the nature of things. It shows a failure to distinguish between indifference, what he calls indifference, things which lay beyond our control, and the single thing over which we do have control, our self-possession of virtue. Stoic therapy for this failure entails a training in discernment and a lifelong process of self-examination. Anger, in a word, can be remedied. Point 5. The remedy for anger, however, must be fortified by habitual ethical practice. While Seneca the therapist recognizes several effective means for combating anger, humor and satire, for example, the one he stresses the most is the process of self-exhortation. As he puts it, the mind must be called to account every day. Within the solitary ritual of interrogation, one becomes, quote, the sentinel and secret censor of the self. When the process is complete, all illusions about revenge are vanquished and its pressing desires are diffused, even rendered ridiculous. This overview reveals a key structural feature which De Ira, an epistolary essay, shares with other ancient works devoted to the passions, namely, its conscious design as a combination of theory and therapy in which the latter presupposes the former. Like a good medical treatise, description and diagnosis of the syndrome are followed by practical recommendations for restoring health. Seneca's preventative approach to the passions was probably understood implicitly by readers of De Ira throughout the Middle Ages, but it was never better appreciated, I would say, than during Stoicism's renewal in the 16th century. With more time at my disposal, I would demonstrate that all of the important elements in Justus Lipsius's program for renewed Senecan philosophical ethics were already anticipated by Ortelius and his circle in Antwerp. This includes the agency of the individual in eliminating false beliefs, the adoption of an Irenic natural philosophy in which ethics and physics were inseparable, and the desire to reconcile fortune and fate with Christian providentialism. Setting aside that demonstration for another time, let us turn to a singularly fascinating image by Bruegel, a work with which and through which a spiritually and ethically self-aware Christian like Ortelius could have enacted a Senecan therapy of the passions. What business do we have with conflict and treachery? Seneca asks in the closing passages of De Ira. That person you're angry with, you don't wish him anything worse than death, do you? He'll die without your turning a hair. You're wasting your effort if you want to cause what is anyway going to be. Let's keep that admonition in mind as we look at our next exhibit, that cosmic compendium of the many forms of untimely death, the triumph of death, which hangs today in the Prado. Ever since there was a modern discourse called Bruegel Studies, interpreters have stood puzzled. What is the occasion of this epic war of extermination carried out by legions of cadaverous combatants? Should we understand it as a vision of some merciless final pestilence, some upending of the natural order, an alternative apocalypse? What agency is at work bringing about such a ruinous end to humankind? Across Bruegel's barren landscape, doom envelops personages from every walk of life, pope and cardinal, emperor and king, noble and peasant, man and woman, lover and fool. Mortal peril comes in all forms. We see conflagrations, executions, accidents, a shipwreck. But mostly it is martial slaughter, a mass extermination of the living by armies of the living dead. In fact, every conceivable form of death is portrayed except the one Seneca guarantees us, the natural conclusion of life in old age. And notably, children and teens are very scarce in the picture. There's only a single infant here who is being menaced by a skeletal dog. Also, and perhaps most significantly, every conceivable resistance to death's agenda is portrayed. Perhaps the worst part of the nightmare are the terrors wrought by the dying upon each other. As Bruegel's macabre army drives their human prey into this enormous coffin sarcophagus with a mechanical trap, the panicked victims create a stampede, unwittingly bringing death to their neighbors. Others seem to be fleeing the charge of a sword-wielding skeleton who is riding a bony nag, a figure called King Death, and the closest Bruegel comes in this picture to the conventional iconography of the macabre. For most of its modern history, the triumph has sat uneasily in Bruegel's oeuvre. Though its authorship is beyond doubt, the painter never affixed a signature, a fact which some have read as an acknowledgement that it harbors some kind of politically subversive content. But we really have no solid evidence for the picture's patron or its intended setting, other than the fact that no less than 5 copies were produced between the efforts of Bruegel's 2 sons, both painters, Pieter the Younger and Jan. I'm showing just 3 of the 5. I think we can take the copies, however, as evidence for a specifically Antwerp-based audience for the theme, and possibly also for the picture's success as a conversation piece. 2 suppositions I'll ask you to bear in mind as we proceed. Now, I'd prefer not to get into the dispute over the painting's date, which divides scholars roughly into 2 camps, those who favor the early 1560s and those who favor the later 1560s, 2 years before Bruegel's death. The years before Bruegel's death, excuse me. Filtering through these differences of opinion is a broad assumption that the triumph's bleakness and violence can only be understood against the backdrop of that churning historical crisis leading up to Alba's Council of Blood and the brutal executions in Brussels on June 5th, 1568. To be sure, the painting looks like a perfect test case for questions about Bruegel's patriotic anger, its ebb and flow between the traumas of history and the expressive possibilities of allegorical pictures. But, to repeat a point I made earlier, the paltry biographical information at our disposal really places hard stops on what we can say about the artist's partisan sympathies and in-group identifications, let alone his personal convictions, let alone his emotional state of mind in the face of Spanish tyranny. Is the work, then, an instance where we find Bruegel dissimulating for the sake of maintaining his conviction in a time of repression and anger and repression and danger? It's certainly tempting to imagine him concealing the dagger of anti-Habsburg satire beneath his lurid encyclopedia of violent death. Such a conclusion strikes me, however, as much too cut and dry. Worse, I think it betrays the real exegetical openness of the Bruegelian picture. My alternative is to treat the triumph of death as a speculative image, a subcategory, as it were, of the philosophical image. Yet it's a category I consider paradigmatic for Bruegelian pictures in general, as my next Venn diagram can also explain, so I don't have to. Under this model, the allegorical picture behaves not as a container with fixed meanings to be discovered inside and then brought to light as we pry it open through an act of interpretation. Rather, the picture behaves, to borrow a well-known concept from James Gibson, as a collection of affordances. Affordances for making thoughts on a topic presented to us. This makes the practice of viewing less a matter of decoding concealed messages and more an exercise in associative network and even, if you will, rhetorical invention. Demanding that we attend as much to its surface as to its putative depths, the allegorical picture serves its beholders as a relay circuit in which the thinking self, under reason's supervision, forms judgments while also reflecting on its own operations. With my time ticking down, let me direct you to 3 motifs in the painting that support this model of the speculative image. Against the backdrop of anonymous mass death, Bruegel stages a series of individualized confrontations in the spirit of Hans Holbein's woodcut series dedicated to the Danse Macabre, popularly known as the Dance of Death. Just a few selections there, arrayed on the bottom for you. And here's the part of the painting that I'm talking about. We're scanning across the picture from left to right. We see a range of social types that are met by their deathly doubles: a king, a cardinal, a pilgrim. And then it continues to the right, a mercenary, a fool, an amorous couple, two ladies in waiting who are being mocked and assaulted by animated corpses there. If Bruegel's painting were simply a conventional moral satirical image, we could assume these vignettes were there to drive home the commonplace that death comes for everyone, regardless of station or status. But this characterization flattens out a key issue. The Danse Macabre was, from its very inception, a speculative genre. The animate corpses who attend the living in this imaginary theater of death are not the anonymous agents sent from the beyond. They are, rather, ever-present projections, alter egos, doubles, who, in their uncanny performance, foist upon the subject the electrifying knowledge that death is always, in a profound sense, with us and with us. It's our birthright, our destiny. The corpses, in short, are rhetorical figures come to life. And as such, their presence alerts us to the fact that the space in which all of this happens is wholly imaginary, a product of the painter's ingenium, or ingenuity, thus a space that invites us to self-examination as well. Doubling their earthly victims, the cadavers offer a spectacle in the root sense of the word, a mirror that implicates us as observers, reflecting back a true image of ourselves. They demand that we speculate on the deep interrelationship of those deaths made present in the picture and my death, now made present through introspection. Is death forever to be a source of indignation, an offense that arouses our anger, as Seneca complains? Or do we face it only with complaints? Or do we face it with the courage of someone in full possession of their own virtue, for whom death is nothing? Other instances of rhetorical artifice alert us to the panel's identity as an imaginarium of death, a work especially suited for speculation. Rolling across the painting's middle ground is a bizarre wheeled contrivance swarmed around by infernal black birds and captained by a hooded demon blasting a horn. It comes into view precisely at the turning point where the mass of armed skeletons turns its vengeance upon the human horde, being channeled into the sarcophagus trap. This fire-belching hell machine, its maw guarded by razor teeth, lumbers up behind the grim horseman, as if ready to swallow up the bodies mowed down by his scythe. Scholars have mostly viewed the monstrous wagon as a residual Boschian element, and indeed several of the gesticulating hybrids who take up the rear read as Bosch citations. And yet, anything we might find genuinely fearsome among the ensemble is offset, indeed, in my view, undermined by a number of rather ridiculous features. Among the demons issuing from the wagon's rear end, one of them strikes this pose, a kind of spooky pose of the Halloween reveler, a cliched aspect which is reinforced by the Boschian wine jug that is suspended above him, and the toy-like wooden wheels, those hilarious wooden wheels that keep the whole contraption going. The closer we look, in fact, the more Bruegel's battle tank from hell looks like a makeshift puppet theater, or the kind of carnival float that was annually pushed through the streets of northern European towns on Shrove Tuesday during the running of the masked men, or the Schembartlauf, as the ritual was called in the well-documented case of Nuremberg. Known as Hölle, hells, and well-preserved in illustrated costume books like I'm showing you, These ephemeral festival contraptions, pulled along on sleds or wheels, and sometimes incorporating pyrotechnics, would be ritually attacked and destroyed in the town square by a group of masked runners, the Läufer. A hellish face, this hellish face, which is formed on the front by the two glowing portals and the portcullis mouth, really seems to confirm the wagon's status as a kind of ironic theater prop. As if to underscore its fictionality, Bruegel has affixed a large convex mirror to its outer wall. Who will see themselves in this weird, dark looking glass? Although its outer-facing angle implicates the painter's beholders, me and you, the most urgent attention it receives is from Anger's symbolic animal, the bear. That is, a bear-like creature with a long, unbear-like tail who rears up on its hind legs to claw at the outer wall of the float. One is tempted to think that the beast is a visual pun on the philosophical formula by Epictetus, bear, forbear, which 16th century moralists used to emblematize the patience, fortitude, and endurance needed to combat anger. But then again, the Dutch noun for bear, the animal that ruins picnics, and the verb meaning to withstand or endure are not homonyms as they are in English, so obviously more work has to be done on the bear. But the clamoring creature's availability as a touchstone for thinking about anger and its therapies can hardly be in doubt. With such an affordance in view, the astute observer is invited to reflect on our bestial tendencies to live under the sway of the passions. As humans possessed of reason, we begin to see the necessity of taming them, an insight that can then be used to illuminate other motifs in the painting. Still another reflexive vignette found in Bruegel's Theater of Death is the skeleton seated on the edge of a stone wharf at the base of a circular structure. He seems to have absconded from the group's activities and stretches his leg out upon the frozen crust of the lagoon where other skeletons are busy drowning their victims. A solitary figure, lost in thought, the figure strikes a classic pose iconographers like to call the Trauergestus, the mourning gesture, despite the fact that its late antique, medieval, and Renaissance history, long before Bruegel, had invested it with a high degree of ambivalence. So not just mourning, not just melancholy, but also kind of vigilant pensiveness and inner reflection. The kind we see given to a skeleton elsewhere in Renaissance culture. This one of the woodcut pages from Andreas Vesalius's Fabric of the Human Body, an anatomical treatise. Why should an anonymous member of Death's attack force lay down arms, step away from the assault on the living, and reflect on the meaning of it all? Why, if not to ironically model the meditative stance of the beholder, to pose as a figure of speculation within a speculative picture? Even the dead are inwardly entangled in the very hermeneutic activity Bruegel's universal pageant of death is designed to arouse. Philosophical therapy in the Stoic mold begins from the premise, as John Sellers puts it, that the person in a state of distress has made a mistake. Either they have overvalued some external thing, or they wish things to be other than they must necessarily be, or they are behaving contrary to human nature, end quote. Seneca affirms this in De Ira. And in the foregoing discussion of Bruegel's Triumph of Death, I've pointed to the possibility that in different degrees, all three of the strategies we find operating in the Senecan model of philosophical therapy, questioning our attachment to indifferent things, examining false judgments that cause distress, underscoring the reality of the nature of things, that all of this finds speculative provocation in Bruegel's imaginative vision. And each of these techniques I've mentioned, the techniques he employs, the Boschian inventiveness, the use of personification, the irony, the reflexive motifs, each lends itself to speculative exercise in a way that promotes a return to reason. The result is therefore more than a chastening vision of present or future terrors, more than a moral sermon in paint. Once activated by the speculative gaze, these elements in Bruegel's tableau serve the beholder as raw material for a cognitive labor aimed at a kind of moral progress, the kind Seneca writes about, progress in overcoming the false belief that death is an evil to be feared. Speculative networking turns the picture into a training ground, as it were, for the self, an arena for working toward the full possession of that most indispensable of virtues, the ultimate weapon against fortune and fate, caring nothing for death. This conclusion sheds an unexpected light on the earliest recorded reference to the painting, Karel van Mander's biography of Bruegel, where the author tersely describes the painting as one in which, quote, expedients of every kind are tried out against death. Far from not doing justice to the painting, as some scholars have said, Van Mander seems to have intuitively grasped that the picture's true theme is not the infinite offense death commits against humanity, but the myriad forms of resistance it inspires. For some, this could mean reducing the picture to a moralizing satire on the folly of refusing death. For indeed, some of the efforts to fend off death's onslaught appear ridiculous, as well as futile. For this perspective we've been developing here, however, it would be more accurate to call the picture a critique of the misguided behaviors the fear of death arouses, each one a negative reflection of that singular Stoic imperative, the imperative of overcoming false judgments. Viewing the spectacle from a lofty height, Bruegel enjoins us to vanquish one of the root causes of anger by breaking the spell of dread death casts over us. That the painter has fashioned a supreme allegory of death's final triumph in order to move us toward this attitude is itself nothing short of ironic. Let me conclude now by wondering aloud whether Bruegel ever reflected on his personal experiences with the vice of anger. Did he consider whether he, the renowned painter, was temperamentally inclined or disinclined to wrath and rage? Such a reflection, if it ever occurred, would have been informed by a peculiarly early modern conception of the self and the passions, a materialist conception in which the individual's state of mind, perceptions, and predispositions were deeply determined by the body's humoral balance. We talked about this earlier, but what I neglected to say is that this conception was deeply gendered. According to the humoral model of health and disease, women, whose nature was commonly held to be cold and humid, were prone to a type of anger pervaded by phlegm and black bile, making the angry woman literally cold-blooded. By contrast, men, in whom the dry yellow bile and hot blood were more prevalent, fell prey to an anger marked by quick-tempered aggressiveness and violence. Surely it did not escape many in our audience today that when Bruegel allegorized anger in his early works, he not only adhered to the conventions of personification by representing anger, era, which is a first declension noun in Latin, as a demigoddess, he also invoked gendered stereotypes concerning female anger. According to the Antwerp humanist Georgius Vivianus, whose book of moral conduct on the duty of the virtuous mistress of the house was published in 1563 by Plantin's Press, female anger is nastier than its male counterpart. Favoring verbal aggression over physical force, it is prone to a calculating, premeditated form of revenge. It unfolds slowly and lasts longer than explosive male anger. It therefore shares numerous traits with hate, odium, and suspicion, making it cold-blooded in both humoral and moral senses. By the way, the same author acknowledges that certain women could erupt in frenzies of hot anger, like our heroic Harrians, Mad Meg and Lady Era, though such outbreaks were short-lived, Vivianus explains, and followed by tears of remorse, which have a cooling effect on the body. Given the way Bruegel's armored warrior goddesses play across these categories, we'd be forgiven for thinking his personifications of this deadly vice are send-ups of the stereotypes current in his day, perhaps even ironic unravelings of theories such as we find in Vivianus. On the flip side, I think it's fair to say that whatever positive value Bruegel accorded to his own anger, not least the righteous, visionary anger which fueled his satires and paradoxes, he would have understood it to be an exclusively male prerogative. And to the extent he considered anger susceptible to moderation, therapeutic mitigation, or stoic suppression, these strategies too he must have seen in masculine terms. Assurance in this could have come from Seneca, for whom capitulation to the passions and the whole ethos of complaint, which builds into anger, were signs of a childish and womanish condition of mind. But whatever its sources or character, for Bruegel and his humanist friends, humoral complexion was never destiny. Through the practice of philosophy, reason might still prevail over the passions. Meanwhile, ambitious works of art might furnish the occasions for an ethical spiritual practice in which the individual, in conversation with philosophical friends, might find and build up the inner resilience needed amidst the slings and arrows of fortune, or at least refuse anger the upper hand whenever it explodes into human affairs. Thank you.
Okay, we have a full half hour for questions. I'm going to click on so when you ask the question, I'm going to pass this to you. It is not going to amplify your voice. It is going to capture your voice so that it will go into our recording so that this can be watched again at some point in time. So please, when you ask a question, please do speak up. We're going to open up the floor.
But I've still got the mic.
Yes.
Hi there. So you mentioned briefly Plato and Aristotle when you were going into Seneca and De Ira. So my question is, if at all, have you found that the ancient Greek concept of menis, of rage, factors into the progression of Bruegel's expression of anger?
Of whose expression?
Of Bruegel's expression of anger.
That's a great question. And to the extent that I'm aware that Seneca's tragedies were being read and discussed and even performed in a limited sense around the same time, and that those tragedies are deliberately hearkening back to mythological prototypes of anger, Medes, for example. I believe that the deeper you go into the literature on Mad Meg, you will find scholars arguing for that mythology coming to the fore. I haven't emphasized it because to me it's it's an even thornier question that I have yet to deal with. So I left it out, but it's a really great point.
Thank you.
And maybe you could introduce yourself, too.
Oh, sure. Hi, I'm Ellen Arnold. I'm a medievalist, a lecturer in the history department.
Yes.
This was so interesting, and it always strikes me whenever I think about Bruegel and some of these works of this period, this question of audience and viewer. And when you mentioned the 5 copies done by his sons, it really drove that home. This isn't on the walls of cathedrals. What do we know about where this painting was originally displayed, and also the copies of the sons? Like, who are his learned observers?
Yeah, that's a crucial question. The answer is that in this case, we just don't know. We don't know who owned it. We don't know where it was displayed. So we have to work from analogy and with parallel cases where, in cases of pictures we do know, for example, the cycle of the months, those 6 great paintings, those were designed, and we know that they were hung in the dining room of one of his great patrons, Nicholas Jongelink. He had this fantastic suburban villa outside of Antwerp, and we know that it was there. Several other Bruegel pictures can be plausibly placed within these elite domestic settings. So they were not designed for churches. They were designed for dining rooms, drawing rooms, humanist studies, and I think that, just to boil it down, I think I've always understood the pieces to be what we call conversation pieces. That they were deliberately, that was their context, but what it meant to have a conversation around a picture, I think is extraordinarily different. What we do today when we stand in a museum and look at a picture and talk about it is sadly a very dim echo of the kind of rhetorical performance that viewing pictures could have among learned people, and like I call them philosophical friends who have the same set of textual references, even the same kind of training in the use of memory, and like the Boethian method of organizing a theme according to topics and then moving through topics and seeing how topics branch out. These are all part of the mental toolkit of the people who saw the pictures at the time, and that's the context in which I think they're best understood. But again, the direct evidence for that is not great.
Great, thank you. I have two questions. I'll start with one. I'm thinking about, I've always been fascinated by the tradition of triumph of death paintings that this comes out of. You showed that example in Palermo, which is incredible. I got to see that one in person for the first time a few years ago. And there's great examples in Tuscany too. A lot of them are fragmentary. And those are all in religious contexts. They're in churches, they're in Christian hospitals and chapels and things like that. That got me thinking about kind of the parallel kind of religious tradition of improving oneself through interpreting kind of difficult images, not difficult in the sense of hard to look at, but like difficult in like intellectually challenging images, right? Like the medievalist Alexa Sand has a great article on kind of devotion and difficulty with hard to interpret exegetical things. And I was just curious if there's like a parallel religious discourse this might be tapping into alongside the kind of secular philosophical one that is similarly interested in kind of the self-improvement that comes through engagement with a difficult thing in that way.
Absolutely. And I would tweak your question by saying that the parallel in the religious culture is not so much do you call it a discourse? Not so much a discourse as a technique, as a habit of mind, as a procedure, as a cognitive labor, something that you go through. And the example that you just mentioned is important. But I think really, and I'll give away part of what I'm working on in a larger sense. This question of speculation is, I think, that one goes all the way back to the 13th, even maybe beyond to the 12th century. And it really finds its métier in those kind of word image constructs that are meant to be picked apart exegetically, not in order to arrive at that single meaning, like, oh, I've solved the puzzle, right? But rather to exercise the mind. And I think speculation is a good word for this. Jeffrey Hamburger uses it, some others use it, Falkenberg uses it, and I think that it's a good one because it always involves mental operations that are both directed toward symbols, but also directed toward the self reflected in the symbols. So I think that that's a huge, I'm glad you asked the question because it allowed me to talk about it.
And I have another question if no one else's hand is up, but if someone else is, here you go.
Hi there, my name's Marga Franz. I'm a studio arts undergrad, but my first experience with Bruegel was through talking about medical history and plague history.
Really?
And so
with this picture?
Yes.
Oh, it's like the poster child for people who do courses on
Yes.
medieval plague.
That's actually how I ran into the triumph of death, was through the discussion of medieval plague. And it was interesting for you to instead kind of correlate it with this idea of anger instead of this focus of like the fear of death. And so I kind of want to understand how you came to that point instead of moving towards a more medical ideal.
I think I understand your question, but I'm not sure I fully understand. How did I get to think about it as a response to the fear of death rather than looking at it from a medical?
Yes, because the way we were taught about it, the way we reviewed it, it was more of a bigger memento mori instead of it was seen as like, this is something that will happen to you regardless, instead of just something that is always around you. And so we never talked about the concept of anger or the connections of emotions between that, just the fear of it.
Right. Yeah, what I would say is that, part of what I tried to do today is, one of the tricks of the trade where you just say, so much has been written about this that I just really can't absorb it, and I don't want to try to communicate it to an audience, so I'm just going to, in a sense, suppress it and think about the painting in a completely different way, right? I can't invalidate all of the great interpretations that have been put forth about this painting, but I think that there's good reason to question the view of it, the very predominant view of it, as being a kind of a medical nightmare related to pestilence, related to fears of the end of the world. We have really, I think, throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance, two models of eschatological thinking about the end. One that is really kind of there all the time because you have to think about the end of the world, and one that is actually inflamed by episodes of fear and panic and disease or pestilence. The prevailing interpretations of the picture tend to look at it without a whole lot of justification in the latter sense, but also seeing it filtered through the sort of apocalyptic explosion of violence associated with the occupation of the Netherlands. So, yeah, there's a lot there, and I can't tell you that it's not in the picture. I can tell you that I think the picture was not meant to be a fear-inspiring sermon. I just don't think Bruegel was that cut and dry, that kind of so. I don't think he wanted his pictures to be sort of like, okay, I got it, and now I can walk away. I know the moral of the story. So my rationale for thinking of it in different terms, but again, against the backdrop of Seneca and his admonitions against death, against the fear of death as an irrational fear.
I'm actually just going to take prerogative here and throw in a question for a moment, because it does relate to what Carl was asking a little bit before. And it is about the term, the speculative aspect. I assumed you chose speculate instead of contemplate because you wanted to suggest that this is specifically Protestant rather than Catholic. Because when we're thinking Catholic, it's we contemplate art, and it helps us to think about ourselves.
Yeah.
Is this specifically Protestant artwork?
That's another good question, and a question that I think I have avoided. Not entirely.
You did avoid it in your talk, so.
Successfully, because I think that Bruegel is not making confessional art. I think that's probably clear.
Yeah.
But I think that he's also one of these characters who is against the idea of confessional art and doesn't and wants to be non-partisan, wants to be above it all in a way, looking at the disaster that confessional wars bring to society. But I think speculate is still the better term. First of all, I think it has a good Catholic pedigree, which we could talk about. The Dominicans used it. Most theologians working in the area of natural philosophy and natural theology used the idea, if not the word, to talk about the way the soul is reflected by contemplating exterior things, and we speculate on these things in order to see God's operations below. So some would call that a good definition of contemplation, but I think speculation has enough of a pedigree. Maybe I can convince you with some, I'll send you some sources, and I'll convince Sarah with some scholarly citations, but it's a great question, and it's one I'm going to have to continue to grapple with. Yeah.
Question over here first.
Hi, I'm Chris Hiley from the English department. I really enjoyed your talk. It just brings up so many questions for me. I've always been intrigued as to why there's a rich pictorial tradition in early modern Low Countries, Netherlands, and yet there's virtually no vernacular art in England in the mid to late 16th century, or the artists are all coming from Germany, in the Low Countries.
Yeah.
But I do see a way in which the questions that you're exploring and the speculation that this image is encouraging and all the questions it's asking are the very same ones that are being asked on the English stage a generation later, really starting in the 1580s, 1590s. And I think in particular, I couldn't stop thinking about Hamlet as you were talking about this image, which is just, riven with anger and obviously the question of revenge. Yeah. And like this image, scholars of Hamlet have tried to detect the single meaning, just as the characters in the play tried to detect the ultimate meaning or problem that Hamlet as a character is suffering. But of course there isn't one, because Shakespeare set up an interrogative text, a text that asks questions rather than gives answers.
Yeah.
And I just thought that the parallels were so suggestive. And with the Seneca, of course, Seneca underpins the tradition of revenge tragedy on the Renaissance stage, and Seneca's being translated into English and is being, discussed in intellectual circles, and that. So yeah, thanks for a fantastic talk. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you for those comments, and I'll keep them in mind. I think the 16th century is a time when art is just posing challenges and provocations to the beholder, not offering simple answers. Yeah.
I haven't quite come up with how I want to say this, so forgive me for working through it in real time. I'm curious, at least from the way that I was understanding you, a part of the kind of speculative nature of this image is coming through the viewing and the kind of discussion surrounding it.
Yeah.
And I know I want to, obviously Bruegel is a working artist creating these for patrons and meant to be purchased by others. Mm-hmm. But I wonder if you could say a little bit about the differences, or if you don't see a difference between the kind of habitual therapeutic cognitive labor of making an image like this versus looking and discussing and thinking through an image like this. And is this in part a kind of therapeutic making, or is the therapy of the image mitigated by the kind of process of having to think it out? I don't know. Yeah.
Yes. No, that's great. And I want to dismiss the idea that I want to, if I were to dismiss the idea that therapeutic making was a kind of anachronism that we project onto early modern artists, then everyone would just say, boo, answer the question. So I'm intrigued by the idea, and I think any kind of study that attempts to create a professional, emotional, psychological profile of a painter has to deal with that in some way. I don't think there's any way we can deal with it unless we want to start looking at Bruegel's pictures and looking at them diagnostically, like psychiatrists looking for signs of anger or catharsis or whatever, which I'm not qualified to do, and I don't think that would make for a very good book. But I think the answer to the question would have to be found in the degree to which an artist like Bruegel, who knows his patrons and who knows where the work is going, is in a way anticipating part of their reaction, participating in it, maybe even being drawn into it in conversation. Like, let's bring old Bruegel in and ask him what he did in this picture. That'll be fun. But again, whether he has an emotional, cathartic attachment to making something, we'll never know. But it's great.
Maybe rather than framing it as in a more subjective manner, just
Okay.
thinking through like anyone making something like this with the intention of it being a speculative image,
Yeah.
Working through, these sorts of practices associated with Seneca, could they then apply those to the practices that kind of associated with making an image like this? Like, you have to go through, you sort of have to create the act of viewing in your mind in order to create the image. Does that make sense?
This is true. This is true, and I think it's an irrefutable truth. As my colleague Michael Fried always says, the painter is the picture's first beholder. And whether that just means that he or she is the first one to look at it before it leaves the studio, or as he would prefer, anticipating the beholder's response in the act of making and designing the picture. We've got to deal with it. Thank you for that question. Okay. I should be writing all this down.
Hi, Alison Cressetta, Department of Art. And I just, I think my question is actually in some ways tied to the last question and even the one before. You had an aside in your lecture that was a figure cloaked in black, and you said, oh, people speculate that this could be the artist, but then I don't think, I would make a case that it's not. And I'd love to hear your case, why you think it's not, and what brings you to that opinion.
One, because I'm tired of hearing people say that it is. That's not a good reason. Two, because if I had to make my own spiritual portrait of Bruegel, I wouldn't think of him as a dark, moody, pessimistic crank who can't laugh at the world. And there's been a lot of wonderful research. Walter Gibson has a wonderful book, and a lot of others have written about Bruegel's laughter, what it means for the painter to make a painting out of this generous spirit of sympathy with humanity and all of its foibles, and to laugh not at his subject but with humanity. So there's the carnivalesque laughter, which has been explored in Bruegel, and I think that that's part of his profile. So I just don't see that as reflecting his true spirit, which of course I can't really tell you that it does or it doesn't. But I think there he's lampooning a particular kind of philosophical, spiritual, social type, but also asking us to see if we are like that. You might have noticed that the picture is a roundel, and it's set in a round frame. It's set in a frame, so it almost looks like a convex mirror bulging out at the middle. The imagery at the front is kind of enlarged, like you'd see a reflection of a convex mirror. And that I think is a strategy for asking the beholder to look into this mirror, and do you see yourself? I'm sure he asked himself the same question.
Okay, Carla, you said that you had a second question. We'll go there, and then over to Ellen.
Sorry if we're going on too long. Do you mind if we go back to the original print that you started the lecture with? I'm curious to ask you to play out the argument a little more. I was very much on board with the interpretation of the painting towards the end. I think it's super interesting, and I'm very convinced by the reading. I guess I'm just curious, with this first image, if I'm understanding your argument correctly, this would have been made before he has this kind of long-running engagement with this group of thinkers in his...
Not necessarily before.
Okay. I just didn't know if you saw this as kind of a before and the other one as an after. You're talking about these sort of different phases, and I'm wondering, does this image lack something that would prompt a similar interpretation to the one that you gave the painting? I mean, if you're sort of interpreting a Bruegelian idiom in a certain way, this painting, this print has got it too, right?
Yeah.
But does it lack something that the painting does? I mean, I think I maybe know what the answer is, but I'm curious just to hear you talk about this work again, now that we have the argument from the end.
Yeah. I think even before you add the moralizing legends, it has a more didactic quality. It's more, and you could probably say this about Dulle Griet as well. It just has more of the expected qualities of an allegory. The emblematic figure in the middle. In this case, we've got two, but still the allegorical figure in the middle, and then like in an emblem book, you've got examples that you've got a superscript that tells you what it's about. You've got the picture, and then you've got some explanatory verses that give you examples, exempla of the main thing. And so I think a picture like this, as wonderful as it is to get immersed in the imagery, is pretty much explicable through identifying the main symbol. And I think it was designed that way because they knew it was going to be a print, and they knew it needed to be more or less comprehensible to the public. So that's the big difference. I don't know if it's a big difference, but that's the difference that I was assuming.
Okay, and then we have one last question here.
Actually, that's kind of where I was wondering is if you could talk a bit about your sense of the difference between the media of print and painting, as you can't obviously pull Bruegel into a conversation if you're reading this book in a different country or looking at this image. So I was going to ask you to talk a bit more about the abstract, unknown viewer of a print.
Yes, right. The anonymous public who is out there, and you're hoping to appeal to them, and you hope that they'll buy the whole set, right? So, the medium is also, I probably have maybe staked too much on the medium, but I think the medium is, as I understand it, a perfect, the medium for making didactic images that are kind of easily digestible, collectible. You show them, you know what it means. You could certainly speculate on it, right? You can hang it in your study, and maybe maybe we could say that the defining social virtue of the print is that whoever's hands it falls into, they're going to do what they're equipped to do with it. If they just want to get a simple moral lesson, that's what they're going to get. If they're a humanist with a lot of ideas about about flying fish, or boats propped up on barrels, there's plenty there for a learned person to extrapolate. Yeah.
All right. I have to say, I've enjoyed this so much, I'm almost sad to have to bring it to an end.
Me too.
But
I'm tired.
thank you so much. If all of you could join me in a round of applause.